Imagine arriving in London between the 12th and 14th centuries. Today it is one of the richest cities in the world, full of lights, cars, and technology. But at that time, none of this existed. Medieval London was a totally different place. A place where living poor was not only difficult, it was a real nightmare. Upon entering the city, you would already feel the shock. The streets were narrow, crooked, and made of dirt. When it rained, they turned into thick mud. And when it was sunny, it raised a dust that irritated the eyes. Many houses were made of wood and straw, and stood so close to each other that they almost touched. The sunlight barely entered between them. For those who were poor, there was no choice about where to live. Usually people crammed into small rooms, often sharing space with relatives, friends, or even strangers. The smell was strong. There was no garbage collection system, and everyone had a way to throw their food scraps and dirt out of the house, right on the street. And don't think there was privacy or hygiene. Bathrooms were rare. Most people used buckets, which were dumped on the sidewalks. It was normal to see someone open the window and throw dirty water or waste out, shouting before not hit anyone. The city was also bustling. Carts, animals, traders, and travelers raced through the streets. Life always seemed rush, but not in the modern sense. It was a rush to survive, to get food, to find work. The poor made up the majority of the population, but had very little. In each corner there was a mixture of smells: fresh fish, salted meat, smoke from bonfires, live animals, leather being worked, and, of course, all kinds of dirt accumulated. For those who arrived there for the first time, it was an overwhelming feeling. But the most difficult was not only material life. It was the constant feeling of uncertainty. There were no guarantees, no government help. If you got sick, hurt, or out of work, you just had to deal with it on your own. The city could be vibrant, but it was also brutal with those who had no money. And that was just the beginning. Living poor in London at that time wasn't just a matter of having little. It was to face every day a city that seemed not to have been made for you. A city that demanded much and offered almost nothing. The daily life of a poor person in medieval London began early and ended late. There were no wristwatches, cell phones, or alarm clocks. People were guided by the sunlight and the noise of the city waking up. As soon as the day cleared, it was time to get up. Most of the poor worked in simple jobs, often heavy and poorly paid. Some were domestic servants, helping wealthy families with tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and carrying water. Others were apprentices of craftsmen, learning to work with metals, leather, fabric, or wood. There were also dock workers, who carried heavy goods arriving by the River Thames. There was no guaranteed rest. The workload could easily go from 12 hours a day, and many worked even more. Everything was manual. There were no modern machines or tools. Each task required strength and patience. The feeding was simple and repetitive. Hard bread, thin soup, a little oatmeal, and on better days, some piece of cheap fish. Meat was rare among the poor as it cost dearly. Most lived on what they could afford, and sometimes that meant just one meal a day. The water was not safe either. The rivers and streams were dirty, and the wells weren't always clean. Therefore, many people drank weak beer, which had less risk of doing harm than ordinary water. For the poor, each day was a struggle against fatigue, hunger, and uncertainty. The city did not have public services like today. There were no hospitals as we know. Those who fell ill depended on healers, home remedies, or simply luck. Even so, there were moments of rest. In fairs, festivals, and religious celebrations, people gathered, talked, sang, and tried to forget for a moment the harshness of everyday life. The community had an important role, because it was often the only support that someone could have. But the fact was simple: living poor there meant living on the edge. Any mistake could cost dearly. And we still do not talk about diseases, which were one of the greatest fears of that time. Living poor in London in the Middle Ages meant living daily with fear of disease. Today we have modern hospitals, medicines, vaccines, and trained doctors. But at that time, none of this existed. People did not understand how diseases arose. There was no knowledge about germs, bacteria, or viruses. The idea of washing hands to prevent contagion simply did not exist. The streets of London were dirty, very dirty. Garbage, food scraps, feces of people and animals, and standing water accumulated in practically every corner. Animals like pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed the streets freely. They spread even more dirt and attracted rats, which were a constant presence in the city. And where there are many rats, there are fleas. And these fleas were responsible for spreading some of the most feared diseases. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, the city faced several outbreaks of serious diseases, but none was as devastating as the bubonic plague, also called Black Death, which hit London with force in the 14th century. For the poor, who lived in cramped places without ventilation and hygiene conditions, the risk was even greater. Many houses had only a small window, and sometimes not even that. Ventilation was minimal. The air was heavy and loaded with moisture, smoke, and musty smell. At any sign of disease, fever, weakness, spots on the skin, people were terrified because they knew that their chances of survival were low, and there was not much to do. The doctors of the time were few and often followed old beliefs that did not work. Some recommended sangrias, others suggested herbs or prayers. Most of the poor could not even afford it. The situation worsened because much of the food was easily spoiled. There were no refrigerators or efficient methods of conservation. Eating spoiled food could cause serious poisoning, and that also took many lives. The city environment favored the worst-case scenario: dirt, contaminated water, bad food, rats, and people living too close to each other. For those who were poor, illness was almost inevitable, and often an announced death. At every turn, in every simple home, someone carried the fear of getting sick. It was an invisible and constant threat. Living in London at that time meant waking up every day hoping not to be next. Working in medieval London while being poor was not only tiring, it was a hard routine, full of risks and without any guarantees. There were no labor laws, no minimum wage, let alone basic rights. You worked for what you could negotiate, and it was almost never much. For many, working meant only one thing: to survive another day. The poor occupied the most exhausting jobs. Dock workers, for example, had to carry heavy bags, huge barrels, and goods arriving from ships. Everything was done by brute force, and any inattention could cause a serious accident. There was no immediate relief. If you got hurt, no one was obliged to help. Others worked as apprentices in workshops. The apprentices spent years learning a trade, but received almost nothing. His payment was mostly food and a simple place to sleep. The learning was rigid and exhausting. Any mistake could result in physical punishment, which was common and accepted by society at the time. Poor women also worked hard. Many were laundresses, seamstresses, street vendors, or maids. Some spent all day washing clothes in the River Thames, in cold and dirty water. Others cooked in rich homes, doing heavy chores for long hours. Hunger was a constant companion of the poor. Food prices changed a lot, and often wages simply did not cover everything. There were winters when food stocks ran out quickly, and the poor had to make do as they could. In years of poor harvest, the situation was even worse. Hunger could lead entire families to total misery. Fish was one of the most common foods, but the cheapest were often of dubious quality. Hard breads were reused for days. Soups, made with scraps and water, were the main dish for many people. Besides, the work never finished. Even after a full day of effort, it was still necessary to take care of the house, fetch water, make simple repairs, and try to maintain some comfort. Even the rest seemed work. Life was a daily battle against tiredness and lack of resources. For many poor people, the greatest achievement of the day was simply to reach the end of it. It was a life that required strength, patience, and an almost superhuman determination. Another big problem for those who lived poor in medieval London was the lack of security. The city did not have a police force as we have today. There were some guards and night patrols, but they were few and could not control everything. This made many poor neighborhoods dangerous, especially at night. Thefts were common. They stole food, clothes, tools, anything of value. Often, who stole was also someone desperate, trying to survive. As the poor could not protect their simple houses, they always lived in fear of being victims of thieves. In addition, there were constant conflicts between groups, families, and neighbors. A small quarrel could turn into a big mess. People carried knives and tools that could be used in moments of anger. For those who were poor, getting into a fight could be fatal because no one had money to treat themselves if they were injured. Another huge fear was the fires. As many houses were made of wood and straw, any spark could turn into a tragedy. Candles, bonfires and ovens were used daily. And without safety measures, a carelessness was enough for the fire to spread. Fires destroyed entire neighborhoods throughout the Middle Ages. When a fire started, there were no trained firemen. People ran with buckets of water, forming lines, trying to put out the flames. It was a desperate effort. Those who were poor could rarely save their few possessions. Many ended up with nothing, needing to start from scratch. There was also fear of the authorities. Although there were few patrols, the punishments were harsh. Minor crimes could result in flogging, imprisonment, or even humiliating public punishments. For those who had little, losing days in prison meant losing work, and losing work meant hunger. And, as if all this were not enough, there was the fear of the unexpected. Floods of the Thames, markets closing because of crises, sudden outbreaks of disease, or sharp increases in food prices. The poor lived on a tightrope. Nothing was certain. Nothing was safe. This feeling of always living on the edge created an environment of constant tension. It was difficult to plan the future when the present was already so unpredictable and threatening. London was vibrant, but for the poor, it was also a city full of risks, where each day could bring a new difficulty. After all this, it is clear why living poor in London between the 12th and 14th centuries was so difficult. It was a life full of challenges that came from all sides. The city grew, trade flourished, churches gained strength, but the truth is that most people lived in extremely simple and dangerous conditions. Poor medieval London had no guarantees. It had no government support, no public services, no hospitals, no labor rights, and no social protection. Each achievement depended on a lot of effort, and each failure could have serious consequences. It was like walking every day on a fragile ground, which could break at any moment. The food was limited, the work was hard, diseases were constant, and the streets were dangerous. The city itself seemed to fight against those who had few resources. Dirt, cold, hunger, fear, and hard work formed a set that consumed people gradually. Even so, there was hope. There were those who dreamed of learning a trade, raising money, opening a small bank in the market, or simply ensuring a better life for their children. This hope was perhaps the only light in the midst of so much difficulty. When we look at London today with its modernity and wealth, it is almost impossible to imagine that one day it was such a hard place to live, especially for the poor. But this is the reality of the Middle Ages, a reality full of contrasts, in which the luxury of a few depended on the effort and suffering of many. And this is the central point. Living poor in London at that time was a nightmare, not because people were weak, but because the world around it was ruthless. It was an environment where survival was already a victory, where each day was a silent battle, where life was a mixture of hope and resistance. Finishing another day alive was almost a triumph. And even if there were moments of joy, festivals, and meetings, the harshness of everyday life always came back. This was medieval London for those who had little. A big city, full of opportunities for some, but a real test of survival for most. If this trip through medieval London showed you how hard life was really for the poor, then don't forget, leave the like to strengthen the channel and sign up to follow more striking stories like that. Your support makes all the difference and helps me to continue bringing content that takes you into the past. Thank you for watching, and until the next chapter.